Hello and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight we're going to do something a bit different. We're going to sit down with one of the longest running animated shows on television and have a quiet conversation about all the places where its logic doesn't quite hold up. Tonight we're talking about the biggest plot holes in Family Guy. Now before we get into it, I want to be clear about something. Pointing out plot holes in a show you love isn't the same as saying the show is bad. If anything, it's a sign of affection. You don't pay this much attention to a show you don't care about. You don't sit there going, wait, hold on, but how does that work? Unless you've watched closely enough that you've started to notice the seams. So this isn't an attack. It's more like two people who've watched way too much Family Guy, sitting around at 1 a.m. going, you know what's always bothered me about that? Family Guy first aired on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl XXIII. It pulled in 22 million viewers on its debut night, which made it look, for about 10 minutes, like Fox had found its next animated hit. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old at the time. He'd built the show out of 2 short films he made at the Rhode Island School of Design, called The Life of Larry and Steve. Fox liked what they saw and gave him a series. What happened next is a long story. The show ran for 3 seasons. Fox cancelled it. The show came back in 2005 after DVD sales, and Adult Swim reruns made it impossible to ignore. And from that revival forward, it just kept going. Different writers came and went, showrunners changed, the animation studio changed, the cultural era changed, what the show was allowed to joke about changed. By the time we get to today, we're more than 20 seasons in, with no real end in sight. That's a lot of storytelling. Hundreds upon hundreds of episodes across more than 2 decades. And when you make that much television, with that many different creative voices, things slip. Plot points contradict each other. Characters forget what they used to know. Storylines get dropped and never picked back up. Ages don't line up. Family trees get reshuffled. Origins get rewritten, and sometimes the show itself notices what's happened and just turns it into a joke, which is its own kind of solution, I suppose. I should also say, before we get going, that I'm not going to be touching the cutaway gags tonight. That's a different video. The cutaways are their own thing, and trying to apply continuity to them would defeat the entire point of the cutaway as a comedic device. We're sticking to the main storylines, the canonical character details, the recurring plot threads, the stuff that's supposed to actually count. Tonight we'll cover a lot of ground. We'll start with the show's foundational rules and the ways those rules don't actually hold together. Things like who can and can't understand Stewie, what Brian actually is, and how time works on this show. Then we'll spend some time on the family tree because the family tree is, frankly, a bit of a mess. We'll talk about Brian's origin story, or rather, his origin stories, plural. We'll get into Peter's 2 fathers and Meg's biological father situation. We'll talk about Quagmire's age, which is genuinely one of the most confusing things in the entire show. We'll spend some time with Stewie, who has more contradictions attached to him than any other character. We'll walk through the Brian death arc and the time machine logic that doesn't quite add up. We'll look at which deaths the show treats as permanent and which ones it quietly reverses. We'll go through specific episodes where the writing leaves visible gaps. We'll talk about all the characters the show forgot about, some of whom you might not have thought of in years. And we'll finish with what might be the strangest meta thread in the whole franchise, which is the show's relationship to the timeline itself, and one episode in particular about 9/11. So plenty to talk about. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, consider subscribing down below. It really does help. But otherwise, get comfortable, settle in, and let's start at the beginning. Or rather, let's start with the rules. Because the rules of this show are the first place things get a bit wobbly. So the most basic level of any show is its rules, the premises that the writers and the audience have to agree on for any of the storytelling to work. And Family Guy, despite being on the air for as long as it has never really settled on what its rules actually are. The biggest 3 are worth talking about, because once you notice them, you can't really unnotice them. The first and most famous one is the question of who can understand Stewie. In the early seasons, the rule was reasonably clear. Brian could understand him. The rest of the family couldn't. Stewie would speak in his fully formed sentences with his upper-class British accent and plot global domination, and Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris would react as if a baby was babbling. That setup gave the show a huge amount of its early comedy. The gap between what Stewie was saying and what his family was hearing was the joke. Then somewhere along the way, that rule started to drift. Chris began to understand Stewie. Not consistently, but enough that they could have full conversations. Lois sometimes seems to understand him, especially when the plot needs her to. Peter in certain episodes responds directly to what Stewie has said. Other times the rule snaps back, and Stewie's the only one in the room hearing himself. The show, to its credit, knows this is a mess. In an episode called Love Blackchally, Brian and Stewie actually debate whether Loretta would be the kind of character who could understand Stewie or not. It's a very brief exchange, and the show moves past it, but it's the writers raising their hand and going, "Yeah, we know, we don't really have a system." And then later, in an episode called Stewie's First Word, they tried to formalise it. The official rule, post-retcon, is that everyone can understand Stewie, but they choose to ignore him or don't take him seriously, which is sort of a beautiful solution from a writer's perspective. It explains every previous inconsistency by making the rule itself the inconsistency. Stewie controls who hears him. The problem is that this doesn't actually match what we've seen across the show. There are dozens of moments where Stewie is clearly trying to be understood and isn't, and dozens more where he's saying something quietly to himself, and someone in the room responds. The retcon paper overs the issue, but it doesn't really resolve it. It just lets the writers move on, without committing to a system. The second foundational rule is the question of what Brian actually is. And this is something that has bothered fans for a very long time, because the show has never picked a lane. Brian is sometimes a person who happens to be a dog. He drinks wine. He drives a car, a Toyota Prius specifically, which has been a recurring detail for years. He has written novels, dated multiple women, run for political office, worked as a screenwriter, attended therapy, gone to college, paid taxes, and lived a fully integrated adult life in Quahog. People treat him as a peer, but then in other episodes, Brian is a dog. He chases his tail, he drinks out of the toilet, he gets distracted by squirrels, he's been put on a leash, he's been told to sit, he sniffs other dogs in ways that are very much not human. He's been sent to obedience school. The show flips between these two modes constantly, sometimes within the same episode, and never really explains why. The conventional answer is that this is the joke. Brian is funny because he's both. The contrast is the point, and I think there's something to that. But it doesn't entirely resolve the rule problem, because there are storylines where it really does matter which version of Brian we're dealing with. His romantic relationships, for example. The show has had Brian date human women, including a long-running relationship with a character named Gillian, and a much-discussed pairing with Lauren Conrad, of all people. The show plays these relationships as relationships, with all the normal beats, and then it remembers Brian is a dog, and there's a joke about it, and the dissonance just sits there. The third foundational rule, the one that creates the most ripples through the rest of the show, is the floating timeline. Family Guy has been on the air since 1999. That's more than 25 years of real time, and in all that time, the characters have aged by almost nothing. Peter is still in his 40s, give or take. Lois is the same. Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland are the same. Adult characters, like Peter, have also changed noticeably over time, with some characters undergoing both aging adjustments and significant personality shifts throughout the show's run. Meg turned 18 in an episode called Quagmire and Meg, which aired in 2012. That's 13 years after the show premiered, and Meg aged by maybe 4 years. Chris is in high school and has been in high school for the better part of 2 decades. And Stewie, the most extreme case, remained 1 year old for 15 real years, before celebrating his 2nd birthday in an episode called Life of Brian 2 Revival Reversal. 15 years to age 1 year. That's a remarkable ratio. The floating timeline isn't unique to Family Guy. The Simpsons has the same setup. So does South Park, sort of. It's one of those conventions that you just accept when you sit down to watch an animated sitcom. The characters exist outside time so the show can keep making jokes about current events without having to age anyone into a different stage of life. But Family Guy is unusual because it doesn't just use the floating timeline as background, it actively bumps up against it. The show references real-world events. It does episodes about specific cultural moments. It has flashback episodes where characters are seen in earlier decades at the same ages they appear to be now. That's where things get strange. Meet the Quagmires has 18-year-old Peter and Lois at a country club ball in what's presented as the 1980s. Quagmire is there too, looking the same age as they are. Meanwhile, another episode firmly establishes that Quagmire is in his 60s. The show is openly aware of all this. There's an episode called Back to the Pilot, which we'll be coming back to a few times tonight, where Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to January 31st, 1999. When they arrive, the past versions of the family are drawn in the original film Roman animation style, which is significantly different from the show's current look. Meg's voice is different because in the actual pilot, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert before Mila Kunis took over the role. The characters pause for cutaways in a slightly different rhythm, and Brian and Stewie comment on all of it in real time while standing in their own pilot episode. It's a very clever piece of meta-comedy, but it's also the show explicitly acknowledging that its past doesn't quite line up with its present. The version of Family Guy that aired in 1999 is a different show than the one that's airing now. The characters speak differently, they move differently, they look slightly different, they behave differently, and the show, for one episode, basically winks at the camera about it. Now here's the thing I find interesting about all 3 of these foundational rules. The show doesn't really try to hide that they don't work. The Stewie understanding rule has been openly debated within the show itself. Brian's dual nature is sometimes the punchline of episodes. The floating timeline has been the subject of an entire meta-episode. The writers know. The audience, on some level, also knows. We've all just collectively decided not to push on it too hard, and I think that's actually fine. A long-running sitcom doesn't owe you consistency. It owes you, ideally, jokes that land and characters you want to spend time with. Family Guy delivers on both more often than it doesn't, and the rule bending is part of how it does that. Cutaways work because the show isn't committed to a strict reality. Stewie's character works because the show can decide, episode by episode, whether anyone hears him. Brian works because he can be a dog or a man depending on what the scene needs. But once you start looking at it analytically, the foundation gets harder to ignore. Because these aren't small details. The rules of who can understand Stewie, what Brian actually is, and how time works on this show, those are the things every other piece of storytelling rests on. And if the foundation moves whenever the show needs it to, then everything built on top of that foundation, the family histories, the relationships, the recurring storylines, the deaths, the time travel, all of it is built on something that's a little bit liquid. That's not a criticism, really. It's more of an observation about what kind of show this is. Family Guy isn't a show that's going to reward you for tracking continuity. It's a show that's going to reward you for showing up and watching the next episode. The continuity is incidental. The jokes are the point. But since we're going to spend the next 2 hours tracking continuity anyway, it's worth knowing up front that the floor isn't solid, which makes it a lot easier to understand how the rest of these contradictions ended up where they are. Since we're talking about characters who don't quite line up, let's spend a bit of time on the backstories themselves, because some of these characters have multiple, completely separate origin stories, and the show has never picked which one is true. Brian Griffin is one of the most central characters on the show. He's been there since the pilot. He's Peter's best friend, Stewie's intellectual sparring partner, the family's voice of reason when reason is needed, and the family's punching bag when reason is in the way. He's been in nearly every episode the show has ever made. You'd think, given that level of importance, that we'd have a clear sense of where he came from. We don't. Brian has at least 3 completely separate, fully canonical origin stories that don't really fit together. The first one is the original. In the very early seasons, the show established that Peter found Brian on the side of the road, where Brian was begging. Brian was already an adult dog at this point, fully verbal in the same general state we see him in throughout the series. Peter took him in. That was the backstory. Clean, simple, didn't really need much elaboration. Then several years later, the show aired an episode called The Man with Two Brians in season 7. In that episode, Brian goes back to a puppy mill in Texas, where he was born, and discovers the fate of his biological family. We meet his mother, a Labrador named Biscuit, or rather, we meet what remains of Biscuit, because Biscuit is dead. Her owners had her taxidermied, and they keep her stuffed body in the living room as a kind of furniture piece. Brian discovers this during the visit, and it's one of those quietly devastating moments that the show occasionally pulls off when it really wants to. He has a whole arc where he has to come to terms with what was done to his mother. But the existence of that whole storyline raises a question. If Brian was raised on a farm in Texas, with a known mother and known siblings, and a known childhood, how did he end up begging on the side of the road in Quahog when Peter found him? The show doesn't address it. The Texas farm just exists now, alongside the original origin, and we're meant to just hold both in our heads. The third origin, which is the messiest one, comes from an episode called Screwed the Pooch in season 3. In that episode, Brian sleeps with Seabreeze, who is Quagmire's prized show dog. Seabreeze gets pregnant. Brian fathers a litter of puppies. He tries to be a responsible father, but the puppies don't really recognise him, and the storyline ends with Brian essentially walking away from the responsibility. That's already a lot. The math, though, gets a bit tangled. Years later, one of those puppies, now grown, comes back as a character, specifically a son of Brian's named Dylan, and Dylan is 13 years old, which would mean Brian fathered him 13 years before that episode, which means Brian was, at minimum, in his early teens at the time, in human equivalent years. The problem is that Brian, according to the show, is 7 years old, sometimes 8. The show has been pretty consistent about that part. He was 6 when the show started, and he's been around that age, give or take, for the entire run. So how does a 7-year-old dog have a 13-year-old son? The standard answer is dog years. Multiply by 7, you get 49, and suddenly the math is more plausible. But the show itself doesn't really commit to using dog years consistently. There's an episode called 420, where Brian is described as roughly 49 in human years and 7 in dog years, which sort of works. But then there's an episode called Foxy Loxy, and there's another episode where Mayor West raises the drinking age in Quahog to 50, and Peter and the guys can't drink. The only person at the table who can legally drink is Brian, and the reason given is that Brian is 56 years old in dog years. So which is it? Is Brian 7 or 49 or 56? The show uses whichever number works for the joke in the episode it's in. And honestly, that's fine for individual gags, but it means Brian's age becomes whatever the script needs it to be at any given moment. This bleeds into the question of how Brian is even allowed to do most of the things he does. He has a driver's license, he votes, he owns a car, he has dated multiple human women. In season 8, Brian dates Rita, a middle-aged woman. He's been engaged, he's enrolled in college, he's published novels. All of those things require either being a person legally, or being a dog so capable of passing as a person that no institutional gatekeeper has noticed. Neither of those is fully consistent with what we see in other episodes, where Brian is treated by characters as an animal. Peter has put Brian on a leash multiple times. He's been left at a kennel. He's been forced to sit in the backyard. He's been sent to obedience school. He's been told to fetch. The show seems to want to have it both ways, which I get comedically. Brian is funny because he can be both a man and a dog. The whiplash between those modes is part of the character. But it does mean that nothing we know about him is really stable. His origin shifts depending on the episode. His age shifts depending on the joke. His legal and social standing shifts depending on what the scene needs. There's an episode called Brian, Portrait of a Dog, which is the 7th episode the show ever aired, where Brian explicitly objects to being treated like a dog. He runs away from home because he refuses to wear a leash. He goes on a journey of self-discovery and comes back resolved that he is a person who happens to be a dog, not a dog with verbal skills. And that episode is presented as a kind of identity statement for the character. Then we get later episodes where that whole arc seems to have evaporated. Brian is back on a leash. Brian is largely treated as a human character, despite being the family's pet. The thing he stood up against in the 2nd episode of the show is suddenly just his life again, and no one comments on it. You can also get pretty far into the weeds with Brian's family beyond just his mother. The Man with Two Brians episode introduced Brian's cousin Jasper, who reappeared in later episodes. There's also Brian's grandmother, who has been seen in flashbacks. There's a cousin. There are, depending on which episode you're watching, multiple half-siblings. The family tree is reasonably elaborate, but it doesn't really line up with the original begging on the street origin in any way that the show has bothered to explain. I think the simplest reading is that the writers, somewhere along the line, decided that giving Brian a real family would make him more textured as a character. Which is true. The Texas farm storyline is genuinely one of the better Brian episodes. The discovery of his mother is one of the show's quieter moments of pathos. So it was a good creative call. It just doesn't square with the earlier setup. And the Dylan storyline, which I think the show genuinely wanted to be a recurring character arc, sort of fizzled out. Dylan appears in a few episodes after his introduction, and then mostly disappears. He's not entirely gone, but he's not in regular rotation either. He's another one of those threads the show set up and quietly let slide. What you're left with is a character who feels coherent in any individual scene, but who, when you try to assemble all the pieces, has multiple lives stacked on top of each other. He was born in a puppy mill, and he was found begging in Rhode Island, and he was the same age when both of those things happened. And he was already an adult when Peter picked him up, but he also had a son when he was very young. None of those statements is wrong exactly. They're just all true at the same time, which can't really be. And honestly, I think the show would be worse if it tried to clean this up. Part of what makes Brian interesting is that he contains contradictions. He's both a successful intellectual and a deeply insecure failed novelist. He's both Peter's wisest friend and the family's most reliable enabler. He's both the moral centre of the household and one of the most morally questionable characters in it. He's both a person and a dog. He's both very young and very old. That's Brian Griffin, a dog who is somehow 10 and 56 at the same time, born to parents in a litter in Texas, with at least one son who shouldn't biologically exist, and a mother who left him with Brian. The simplest explanation is that the writers just keep writing what they want to write, and the canon is whatever the latest episode says it is. Which brings us, naturally, to the rest of the family. Because Brian isn't the only one with a backstory that doesn't quite hold up. There's the matter of who Peter's actual father is, and those are conversations worth having one at a time. Let me start with Francis Griffin, because for the first 5 seasons of the show, Francis Griffin was Peter's stepfather. There's no asterisk on that. He was an established recurring character. We met him. He had a personality, a strong one. He was a deeply Irish Catholic, openly disapproving of Peter, religiously rigid, often cruel, and one of the running tensions in the early seasons was Peter's complicated relationship with him. Francis appeared in episodes across the second through fourth seasons of the show. He was at family gatherings. He had storylines built around him. He was, by any reasonable definition, Peter's dad. The show established this clearly and built character moments on top of that establishment. Then season 5 aired, and an episode called Peter's Two Dads came along, and the show simply changed the answer. In that episode, Francis dies. Francis dies when Peter falls down the stairs in Peter's Two Dads. After his death, Lois reveals to Peter that Francis was actually his adoptive father, and that Peter's biological father is an Irishman named Mickey McFinnigan, who lives in a small town in Ireland. Peter goes to Ireland, meets Mickey, and Mickey is essentially a different version of Peter, but Irish. Now, retcons happen on long-running shows. That's normal. Soap operas do it constantly. Sitcoms do it. Sometimes a writer wants to take a character in a new direction, and the existing backstory is in the way, so the show finds a way to revise the past. That's a normal creative move, but the Mickey McFinnigan retcon is unusually clean, in the sense that the show just made a decision and committed to it. Francis is dead. Mickey is the dad now. Peter has an Irish heritage that he didn't have before. The Irish heritage becomes a regular feature of his character going forward. There are episodes where Peter goes back to Ireland. There are jokes about his alcoholism being inherited from Mickey. The new backstory is fully absorbed into the show. What the show doesn't do is reconcile any of it with what came before. All those early season storylines that built around Peter and Francis as biological father and son were addressed in the later episode, Peter's Two Dads, where the retcon revealing Mickey McFinnigan as Peter's true biological father was revealed. The episodes still exist. They still air in reruns. The contradiction is just there, and the show has moved on. Now let's talk about Meg, because Meg has a similar problem, except hers is messier and less resolved. In the same episode where Brian fathered Seabreeze's puppies screwed the pooch in season 3, there's a moment where Peter has Brian answer a set of questions about Griffin family knowledge to prove how well Brian knows them. The whole bit is structured around private family information that only an insider would know. And one of the questions and one of the answers that Brian gives is that Peter isn't actually Meg's biological father. Meg's biological father is a man named Stan Thompson. This is presented as a real, established fact about the family. Brian, as the character who knows everything, knows it. Peter doesn't object. The information just lands. And then the show, in true Family Guy fashion, never really does anything with it. Later episodes treat Peter as Meg's biological father. In Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, Brian, the same character who confirmed the Stan Thompson thing, tells Meg that life isn't fair, and that part of the reason is that she looks like Peter. The implication of that line is that Peter is her biological father. That's the whole reason the joke works. If Peter isn't her dad, the line doesn't track. There are other episodes where the Stan Thompson reveal is contradicted in passing. The show seems to have decided at some point that the Stan Thompson thing was a one-off gag and not a real piece of canon, but it never came out and said that. It just started writing Peter as Meg's dad again, and the audience was meant to forget the earlier reveal. Some fans have argued that the Stan Thompson reveal was always a joke, that Brian was making it up to mess with Peter, that it was never serious. I don't think that reading really holds up if you watch the episode. The reveal is played with the same weight as the other private family information Brian recites. There's no indication that he's lying. The more honest answer is that the writers wanted a punchy reveal in season 3 and didn't think much about whether they were going to follow up on it. By the time later seasons came around, the show had moved on, and the Stan Thompson thing just got quietly shelved. It exists in the canon. It's never been retracted. It's just not being used. Now the Pewter Schmidts, Lois's family, this is where the timeline really starts to wobble, Carter Pewterschmidt and Babs Pewterschmidt are Lois's parents. They've been on the show forever. Carter is a recurring character with a strong personality. He's wealthy, dismissive of Peter, very involved in the family's business. He's been in dozens of episodes. Babs is a bit more in the background, but also a regular presence. In an episode called Welcome Back, Carter, we get a flashback to how Carter and Babs met. The flashback is set in what's depicted as the late 1940s or early 1950s. They meet, they fall in love, they get married. Carter takes over the family fortune. Standard origin story stuff. The problem is the math. If Carter and Babs met in, say, 1950, and they were in their 20s at the time, that would put them well into their 90s by the time Family Guy is being made. But Carter is depicted as a man in his 70s. He moves like a man in his 60s. Babs is similar. They're not depicted as nearly century-old people. You could say this is just the floating timeline doing its work. Family Guy isn't really set in a specific year. The characters exist outside of strict chronology, but the Welcome Back Carter episode goes out of its way to date the meeting. It uses the visual cues of the period. It commits to the 1950s setup. There's also the matter of how long Carter and Babs waited to have Lois. Lois, if you accept that she's in her early 40s on the show, would have been born in roughly the early to mid-1960s. So Carter and Babs would have had her, 10 or 15 years after they met. That's possible. People do that. But it's a long gap, and Lois has older siblings, so the math has to fit them in too. The simplest reading is that no one in the writer's room was tracking this. The Welcome Back Carter episode wanted to do a period flashback, picked a period that worked for the jokes, and didn't worry about how it lined up with the rest of the family tree. And then there's the Jewish heritage retcon. In a season 8 episode, the show reveals that Lois is technically Jewish. Her mother Babs is Jewish, which means by the standard rules of religious lineage, Lois is too. Peter has a brief religious crisis about it. The episode plays the reveal as if it's a significant piece of family information. Now this is fine in isolation. Plenty of shows discover Jewish heritage in a character's family. It's a reasonable late series development, but Lois has appeared in over 100 episodes by this point, with no indication ever that her family has any Jewish heritage. The Pewterschmidts have been depicted at Christmas, at Easter, at various religious events that would be unusual if they were Jewish. None of those previous moments are reconciled with the new revelation about the Griffins. The show just inserts the heritage into the canon and moves on. The Pewterschmidts also have a son named Patrick, who is introduced as Lois's brother in an episode where it turns out he's been institutionalized for years before becoming a serial killer. There's also a half-brother, Stewie's, and various cousins who appear in different episodes. The family tree is being built in real time as the writers find uses for new relatives. I think what all of this points to is something pretty simple. Family Guy isn't a show that writes from a series Bible. It doesn't have a single document that lists who everyone's parents are, who's biologically related to whom, who got married when, who was where, during what decade. It's a show that writes the next funny story and lets the canon expand to accommodate it. For a comedy, that's a perfectly reasonable approach. It's the same setup most long-running animated shows use. The only difference is scale. Family Guy has been on for so long and has had so many shifts in tone and direction that the accumulated contradictions are visible from space. One thing I keep coming back to is how the show keeps quietly reshuffling everyone's family tree and just hoping no one notices. The Stan Thompson reveal would be a huge deal in a more serialized show. Peter not being Meg's biological father would change everything about their relationship, which is already loaded. Francis Griffin not being Peter's biological father would recontextualize 5 seasons of episodes. Lois being Jewish would change her character's whole religious framework. Each of those reveals lands with the weight of a major character development. And then the show just keeps making episodes, as if the reveal never happened. The Griffin family tree, if you tried to draw it on a piece of paper, would have to include at least two versions of Peter's parentage, at least two versions of Meg's parentage, a Texas branch of the dog's side of the family, a retconned Jewish heritage on Lois's side, multiple half-siblings and cousins on Lois's side, and a son Brian had with a different dog who is older than Brian himself was at the time. It's not a family tree, it's more like a family thicket, and the show isn't pruning it. Since we've been talking about characters whose ages and backstories don't add up, there's one character who has the most famous age problem on the entire show, and that's Quagmire. There's an episode in season 7 called Foxy Lady. It's a perfectly fine episode. Not one of the greats, not one of the worst, but in the middle of it, there's a moment where Quagmire's driver's license is shown on screen, and the license very clearly lists his date of birth in a way that makes him 61 years old. That's not a throwaway gag. The number is right there, written in production design detail. The writers picked it. Someone in the animation team rendered it. It made it through whatever notes process the episode went through. As of season 7, Quagmire is canonically 61. Now this is interesting because Quagmire does not look 61. He looks like a guy in his 40s. He acts like a guy in his 40s. His sexual exploits, his energy level, his lifestyle, none of it suggests a man in his 60s. The standard fan explanation, partly supported by a joke in the show itself, is that he stays young by eating carrots. The carrot thing is a real joke the show has made. It's not really a serious in-universe explanation, but it's the closest the show has come to addressing the age gap. The problem is what happens to that 61-year-old number when you start checking it against other episodes. In season 12, there's an episode called A Fistful of Meg. In that episode, Quagmire tells Meg about how he was bullied in 1986. There's a flashback, and in the flashback, Quagmire is a child. He looks like a teenager. He's clearly a teenager. But if he was a teenager in 1986, and Family Guy is set in roughly the present day, that would put him in his late 30s or early 40s, which is what he looks like. But it's a full 20 plus years off from the 61 number from Foxy Lady. You can't have both. He can't have been a teenager in 1986 and also be 61 in the present. Those numbers are incompatible. And then there's Meet the Quagmires from season 5. That episode involves Peter going back in time to relive his 18th birthday. He's at a country club ball with 18-year-old Lois. And Quagmire is there too, also looking 18. 3 friends, all the same age, at the same event. For that scene to work, Quagmire has to be roughly Peter's age. Peter is in his 40s on the show, so Quagmire, by the logic of Meet the Quagmires, is also in his 40s, which contradicts the 61-year-old license, which lines up with A Fistful of Meg, which means the show, depending on the episode, treats Quagmire as either roughly Peter's age or roughly 20 years older. This created one of the better-known plot holes in the show, and it shows up in an episode that I think is genuinely funny on its own terms. It's an episode where Mayor Adam West raises the drinking age in Quahog to 50. Suddenly Peter and his friends can't buy alcohol anymore. They get desperate. The only person they know who can legally drink is Brian, because Brian is 56 in dog years, which puts him over the new drinking age. The whole storyline hinges on the idea that Brian is the only one who can buy beer, but if you take the Foxy Lady canon seriously, Quagmire is 61. He's well over the new drinking age. He could walk into any store in town and buy as much alcohol as he wanted for all of them. He's the obvious solution. The premise of the episode collapses if you bring his official age into it. The show, of course, doesn't bring his official age into it. It pretends it doesn't exist for that episode. Quagmire is 40-something for the purposes of that storyline, and Brian is the only legal aged option, and we're meant to just go along with it. So Joe Swanson, Joe is the 4th member of the friend group, the police officer in a wheelchair. And Joe has his own continuity issues, mostly around his paralysis. In some episodes, Joe was paralysed by a fall. He was a cop, he was chasing a criminal, he fell off something, and that's how he ended up in the wheelchair. In other episodes, the explanation involves a fight with the Grinch on a rooftop on Christmas Eve, which is a much more Family Guy explanation, but doesn't quite line up with the more grounded version. And then there's a third version involving a different injury chain. The show has used different origins at different times depending on what the episode needed. Then in season 14, there's an episode where Joe becomes quadriplegic during a running of the bulls incident. He'd briefly been able to walk again. He loses that ability in the second injury. The arc isn't really treated with much weight. Joe goes from temporarily walking back to permanently in the chair, and the show keeps moving. Joe's paralysis is one of those things that the show treats with two different levels of seriousness, depending on what it wants from him in a given episode. Sometimes his disability is the source of pathos, as when episodes deal with his frustration or his physical limitations. Other times, it's a sight gag, with the chair flipping over for laughs or Joe being launched off ramps. Both modes coexist in the same show, sometimes in the same episode. There's also the question of how much the characters have actually aged across the show's run. We talked earlier about how the floating timeline means most characters stay roughly the same age forever. But there are exceptions, and they're worth noting because the show makes specific choices about who ages and who doesn't. Stewie, as we said, was born as a 1-year-old. Or rather, he was depicted as roughly one when the show started. He celebrated his first birthday in an episode called Chitty Chitty Death Bang, which aired in the first season. So he was somewhere just under 1 when the show began, turned 1 in season 1, and then stayed 1 for the next 15 real-world years. He did not celebrate his second birthday until an episode called Life of Brian. In Showtime, Stewie aged 1 year. In real time, all of that. That's the most extreme example of the floating timeline on the show. Chris is a bit different. Chris was 13 when the show started. He was in middle school, now he's in high school, and has been for most of the show's run. He's aged a bit, but not much. Maybe 2 or 3 years over the whole series. He hasn't graduated, he hasn't gotten his license. He's just been a teenager in some indeterminate stage of high school for ages. Meg has aged the most. Meg was 15 when the show started. In Quagmire and Meg, in season 10, she turned 18. That episode aired in January 2012, 13 years after the show premiered. So Meg aged 2 years in 13 years of real time. Still very slow, but faster than anyone else. After that birthday, the show sort of stopped tracking Meg's age. She's been around 18 ever since, even though it's been more than a decade since that birthday episode. She hasn't graduated from high school in any meaningful way, even though she's been a senior multiple times. The adults, meanwhile, are static. Peter is 43 in some episodes. He's also 43 in other episodes that aired 15 years later. Lois is older than she was when the show started. Same with Brian, ignoring the various age numbers we've already covered. Same with Quagmire and Joe and Cleveland and Herbert and everyone else in the recurring cast. And this creates strange effects when the show does flashback episodes, because the flashbacks have to land somewhere in time. If a character was 18 in a flashback and the present-day character is 43, the flashback should be 25 years ago. 25 years ago, from when though? From the airing of the episode? From some unspecified present the show uses? The flashbacks tend to use whatever decade fits the period jokes the writers want to make. The 80s are popular, the 70s show up. Sometimes the 50s, the actual math is never the point. I find this part of the show genuinely interesting, by the way. Not the inconsistencies themselves, but what they reveal about how Family Guy thinks of itself. The show isn't a story being told in a fixed timeline. It's more like an ongoing series of jokes about a stable set of characters. The characters exist so that the jokes can land, and the timeline serves the jokes, not the other way around. Which is fine, it's a sitcom, that's how sitcoms work. But when the show pretends to commit to specific dates and ages, and then uses different ones in the next episode, it does create the visible cracks we've been talking about. The other thing worth saying about the supporting cast is that almost none of them have stable backstories. Mort Goldman, the Jewish pharmacist, has had multiple different backgrounds across the show. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was famously pregnant for the first 7 seasons of the show, with the pregnancy finally resolving when Susie was born. Cleveland Brown moved away to have his own spin-off show, and then moved back when that show was cancelled, and the show treated his return as a natural thing rather than the corporate decision it actually was. Everyone on this show has a backstory that's been quietly rewritten at some point. And since we've just landed on Stewie, let's spend a bit of time with him, because Stewie is where a lot of these inconsistencies really pile up. Let me start with the time machine, because the time machine is one of those Family Guy elements that gets used so often, it's easy to forget that it has rules, or rather, it's easy to forget that it doesn't really have rules. Stewie built his first time machine in an episode called Mind Over Murder, which aired in the first season. The original purpose was simple. He wanted to skip teething. He didn't like the pain of growing teeth, so he built a machine that would let him fast forward through it. The prototype was destroyed in the same episode when Peter tripped over it. Stewie started teething. The end. Then across subsequent seasons, Stewie built more versions of the time machine, landing him in 1939 Poland during World War II, a wristwatch version, a return pad version that worked alongside other models. The technology kept evolving, but the core idea stayed the same. Stewie has access to time travel. He uses it casually. The implications of that are huge, by the way, and the show has never really sat with them. Stewie has the ability to alter human history. He's a baby in Rhode Island with a working time machine. He could prevent wars, he could prevent assassinations, he could solve essentially any problem the family ever has. He could go back and stop his own birth if he wanted to, given how often he claims to resent his mother. The show uses the time machine for individual gags and adventures. The Road 2 episodes often feature time travel. Stewie and Brian have visited Nazi Germany, ancient Rome, the moon landing, 1990s Quahog, the future, alternate universes, the Titanic, and various other settings. Each time, the trip is treated as an isolated story. They go somewhere, something happens, they come back. The status quo resumes, but here's the part that gets confusing. In the episode Life of Brian, Stewie destroys his time machine. He's tired of close calls. He decides he doesn't want it anymore. He breaks it apart. And then, in the same episode, Brian is killed by a car. Stewie is devastated. He wants to undo Brian's death, but he can, despite having just destroyed his time machine. He spends the next episode and a half trying to rebuild it, and he does. Time passes. The family purchases a replacement dog named Vinny. Stewie grieves. Then in Christmas Guy, Stewie is at the mall and sees his own past self buying a toy. He recognises the moment because it happened shortly before Brian's death. He realises his past self has a working time return pad. He approaches his past self, distracts him, and steals the return pad. Then he uses it to go back in time and save Brian. Now I love this storyline. The emotional payoff of Brian's return is one of the better moments the show has ever pulled off. The reunion scene is genuinely warm. The fact that present-day Stewie has to fade out of existence to save Brian is treated with appropriate weight. As a piece of storytelling in the moment, it works, but the logic falls apart if you look at it for more than about 30 seconds. The Family Guy fan wiki itself notes this. If Stewie has the ability to time travel and he wants to save Brian, why does he need to wait until he happens to spot his past self at the mall? Why doesn't he just rebuild the time machine from scratch and go back? The episode says he can't because the parts aren't available, but this is Stewie. He's the smartest person in Quahog. He's built spaceships, he's built clones, he's built weapons that could level cities. He can't put together a time machine from spare parts in a household with as much junk as the Griffins have. And here's the bigger one. If he can use a return pad to go back in time at any moment, why doesn't he just go back to the moment before he destroyed the original time machine and stop himself from destroying it. That would solve the problem instantly. The parts not available excuse only applies in the present. He has access to every past version of his own time machine. He could literally pull the original out of the past and bring it forward. He doesn't. The episode doesn't address why he doesn't. The show needs the emotional beat of the random encounter at the mall, so the logic gets shaped to make that beat happen. There's also a quieter continuity hiccup in the same arc. In Life of Brian, right before Brian dies, Stewie decides to go back inside the house to get his knee pads. He stops at the door. He turns. He goes inside. We see this clearly. In Christmas Guy, when Stewie from the future is watching the same sequence happen, his past self never stops at the door. He just walks straight in. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of thing that catches your eye on a rewatch. The show is replaying the same moment with slightly different choreography. That's the time machine. The rules of how it works seem to change every time it's used. The show is aware that they change, and there's no real consistent system. It's a plot device that lets the writers do whatever they need it to do. Now let's talk about Stewie himself, separate from the time machine, because the character has gone through one of the most dramatic, unacknowledged evolutions in the show's history. In the early seasons, Stewie was a homicidal supervillain. His main motivation was killing his mother. He had elaborate plans involving lasers, mind control, world domination. He talked like an evil Rex Harrison, which is actually how Seth MacFarlane has described the original conception of the character. He plotted matricide casually. He referred to Lois as the vile woman. He kept a teddy bear named Rupert as his confidant and his only real attachment. That character is, by any honest reading, gone. The Stewie of the later seasons isn't trying to kill Lois. He doesn't plot world domination anymore. He still has his accent and his vocabulary, but the menace is mostly drained out of him. He's become more of an emotionally complicated baby with elaborate inner life, less of an evil genius. The show has addressed the transition through various episodes, most notably in Season 6 episodes 4 and 5, where it acknowledged its own shift in Stewie's character. There's no episode where Stewie reflects on giving up his murderous ambitions. There is a moment where he decides he loves his mother now. The change just sort of happened, gradually, across many seasons. The writers softened him because softer Stewie was easier to write story arcs for, and the harder edges of the earlier character didn't fit the show's later tone. And then there's the sexuality question, which is one of the more publicly discussed contradictions in the character. Stewie, depending on the episode, is gay, straight, bisexual, asexual, or, in the show's preferred phrasing, undefined. In some episodes, he's clearly attracted to women. He's had a recurring crush on a baby named Olivia, and another on Penelope, and various other female characters. In other episodes, he's clearly attracted to men. He's fantasized about Brian. He's sung songs to sailors about preferring to get it on with them rather than with women. He's flirted with male characters openly. He's made comments suggesting same-sex attraction. Seth MacFarlane has talked about this in interviews. He said at one point that he thought Stewie would ultimately be gay or possibly a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual, deliberately keeping it vague because he's a 1-year-old. Then he retracted the statement, saying that a 1-year-old cartoon character can't really be definitively anything in terms of sexual orientation. The show's writers have backed up this position, essentially treating Stewie's sexuality as a permanent open question. The cleanest expression of this came in the 300th episode of the show, called Send in Stewie Please, which aired in 2018. The episode is commercial-free. It takes place almost entirely in a child psychologist's office, with Stewie talking to a therapist voiced by Sir Ian McKellen. The episode goes deep into Stewie's inner life. He admits things about himself that he's never admitted before. And one of the things he addresses directly is his sexuality. What he says is essentially that he's not gay, but it's also not because he's gay, and he's not as gay as he used to be. And if anything, he might be less gay now. which is a remarkably non-committal piece of dialogue for what was set up as the big moment of self-revelation. The writers, per their own interviews, deliberately kept it ambiguous because they wanted to preserve the joke flexibility for future seasons. The same episode reveals that Stewie's British accent is a psychological facade. He puts it on. His real voice is an American kid's voice, which we hear briefly during the therapy session. The reveal is treated as a major character moment. Stewie has been hiding behind the accent his whole life. The accent is a defense mechanism. The episode positions this as a deep insight into who he really is. Then by the end of that episode, Stewie was back to using the British accent, and the reveal was essentially never referenced again. The accent kept going. The real voice was set aside. The 300th episode existed in its own little canonical bubble. This is a recurring problem with Stewie. Whenever the show tries to commit to who he is, the commitment gets walked back in the next episode. He's gay until he's not. He's straight until he's not. He's evil until he's not. Stewie's real voice is American, though he uses a British accent in most episodes. He's a baby who can't have sex, which the show has explicitly stated, until in some episodes he clearly can. He'll eventually grow up to be a meek, ordinary adult, which we see in Stu and Stewie's Excellent Adventure and the direct-to-DVD film, but he's currently the smartest person in Quahog. Every fact about him is conditional. There's also the broader question of what happens to him at puberty. The show has shown his future self multiple times, and the future self is portrayed as a successful villain with accomplished schemes. The implication is that Stewie loses his intelligence. As he grows up, he becomes regular. The show has never explained the mechanism. The smartest person in the room becomes someone who never quite finds his footing. That's a tragedy if you sit with it long enough. The show doesn't sit with it. So that's Stewie, murderous and gentle, gay and straight, brilliant and forgetful, British and American. He contains every possibility the writers want him to contain. The character is whatever the next episode needs him to be. Which sets us up nicely for the storyline that broke the show briefly, and that the show then had to undo. The Brian death arc, because that's where all of these inconsistencies converged into one really visible moment. We covered the time machine logic of the Brian death arc in the last segment, so I won't go back over it. What I want to talk about now is the rest of that storyline. Because the death of Brian wasn't just a single episode, it was a small arc, and the arc has a lot of other strange edges that I think get less attention than the time travel stuff. The first thing is Vinny. Vinny was the replacement dog the Griffins adopted after Brian's death. He was voiced by Tony Sirico, who you might know as Paulie Walnuts from The Sopranos. The casting was perfect for what the show was going for. Vinny was an Italian-American street dog from a tough background. He was warm, he was loyal, he bonded with Stewie in a way that the audience could feel happening in real time. That bonding is actually part of why the death arc didn't quite work for a lot of viewers. Vinny was good, genuinely good. Tony Sirico's performance was warm and grounded, and the writers gave Vinny real emotional stakes. There's a scene in Christmas Guy where Stewie tells Vinny he has to go back and save Brian, and Vinny accepts it with a kind of dignity that the show doesn't always reach for. He understands that saving Brian means erasing himself. He encourages Stewie to do it anyway. It's a quiet, well-played scene. And then Brian comes back, and Vinny essentially vanishes. He's not gone technically. He shows up in 1 or 2 episodes after Brian's return, mostly as a background character. There's a couple of brief appearances where he's referenced. But the warm, fully developed character we got to know across those few episodes just disappears from the show's regular rotation. The friend the family had bonded with is gone, and no one really talks about it. That's a strange way to handle a character the audience had grown to like. It also raises the question of where exactly Vinny ended up. If Stewie used the time machine to alter the timeline so that Brian never died, then Vinny shouldn't exist in the current timeline at all. The Griffins never had a reason to adopt him. He should be back wherever he was before Brian's death, living some other life. but the few times he does appear post-revival, he seems to remember the Griffins, which suggests he's still in that branch of the timeline somehow. The show doesn't address it. Then there's the matter of New Brian. Because Vinny wasn't actually the first replacement dog the Griffins took in. There was an earlier one, going back to season 8. New Brian was a character introduced in an episode called The Man with Two Brians. Yes, the same episode where Brian's mother was revealed to be the taxidermied Biscuit. The plot was that Brian, after getting in trouble for various behaviour issues, is essentially exiled, and the family adopts a friendly, cheerful new dog as a replacement. New Brian was sort of an inverse of original Brian. Where Brian was cynical and pretentious, New Brian was earnest and warm. Where Brian drank too much and was bitter, New Brian was cheerful and supportive. He was, on paper, a better dog. The family loved him. The problem was that New Brian was also presented as a creep. He started showing inappropriate interest in Rupert, Stewie's teddy bear, in ways that were played as deeply uncomfortable. Stewie got upset. Brian came back, and in a scene that I think a lot of people remember more than the rest of that storyline, Stewie kills New Brian, dismembers him, and disposes of the body in trash bags. That scene is in the episode. It happened. It's canonical. The Griffin family, at least Stewie specifically, has now killed and disposed of 2 different replacement dogs across the show's run. The show treats both of these events with very different weights. Vinny gets a tender farewell. New Brian gets murdered for laughs. The show is choosing where to invest its emotional capital. And then there's Life of Brian 2, Revival Reversal, a fan-created concept that reflects the show's death arc referencing. That's the episode where Stewie celebrates his first birthday, which I mentioned earlier. The episode reuses the title structure of Life of Brian as a sort of callback, and it includes a few references to the death arc itself. It's a soft acknowledgement that the show knows the Brian death thing was a big deal, and that they're still using it as a touchstone for character moments. But it doesn't really resolve the bigger meta question, which is the one I want to talk about for a moment. Because once Stewie has used the time machine to save Brian, you have to ask why he hasn't used it to save anyone else. The Griffins have lost several major characters over the years. Some of those losses were treated with weight in the show. The death of Diane Simmons in the season 9 premiere, and then there were fewer, was a big moment. Multiple recurring characters died in that episode. Muriel Goldman, Mort's wife, was killed. Other minor characters were killed. The show treated it as a serious event. Stewie could fix all of that. He has a time machine. He could go back, prevent the murders from happening, save all of them. He chooses not to. And the show never addresses the choice. You could argue that Diane Simmons isn't important enough to him personally. He doesn't have an emotional connection to her. Why would he use his powers to save someone he barely knew? Fair enough. But the same logic should apply to Vinny in reverse. Vinny was a friend. Vinny was bonded with him. Vinny accepted his own erasure to save Brian. Stewie could go back and save both of them. He doesn't. Time travel for Stewie is something he uses for adventures with Brian and for the occasional emergency. It's not treated as a moral resource. He doesn't think of himself as having an ongoing responsibility to fix things. This is true of any time travel story, really. You can poke at any of them long enough to find this question. Why doesn't Marty McFly go back and stop the Lincoln assassination? Why doesn't Doctor Who solve all of human history? The standard answer is that time travel stories have to have stakes. And if the protagonist can fix anything, there are no stakes. So the writers limit the time travel to one specific goal per story and ignore the broader implications. Family Guy does the same thing. The time machine is a tool for individual episodes. Stewie's ability to alter history is not really a character trait. It's a plot device that gets activated when needed and put away when not. But because the show has used it for Brian specifically, in such an emotional and weighty way, the absence of its use elsewhere becomes more visible. Brian's life is the one Stewie chose to save. Everyone else's losses, by implication, weren't worth the effort. That's a strange position for the show to take, even by accident. There's also a question about why Brian was killed in the first place. The producers have said in interviews that the death was meant to shake up the show, to give the audience something to react to create a story arc that had real weight. They knew Brian was coming back. They planned the return from the beginning. The whole thing was a piece of strategic plotting that lasted exactly 3 episodes. The audience didn't react the way the producers expected. The reaction was overwhelmingly negative. Petitions were started. The episode is still one of the lower-rated entries in the show's history. On IMDb, fans wanted Brian back, and they wanted him back quickly, and the show obliged. This raises a question that I find more interesting than the time travel mechanics. Why did the show want to do this in the first place if they knew they were going to reverse it? The standard answer is that they wanted the emotional moment of the return. They wanted to give the audience something to miss. They wanted the relief of Brian coming back to feel earned. I think there's something to that. The reunion scene in Christmas Guy is more powerful because of the absence. The audience genuinely felt the loss for a few weeks. The return felt like a reward. As a piece of audience manipulation, it worked, but the cost was a permanent strangeness in the show's relationship with permanence. Once the audience knows that the show will undo any major change, the next major change carries less weight. Every death from this point forward exists under the shadow of the Brian arc. Every dramatic event has an implicit asterisk. The audience has learned that the show will rescue itself from any storyline it commits to, and that's a real thing the show has had to navigate ever since. Various dramatic moments in later seasons have had to fight against the audience's awareness that Family Guy is a show that walks things back. The dramatic stakes are softer because we know. So that's the Brian death arc, a storyline that was meant to be emotionally weighty, that worked in the moment, that introduced 2 new characters who barely got to exist and that quietly rearranged the show's relationship with consequence going forward. Vinny is gone. New Brian was murdered. Brian is back. Stewie has a time machine he uses for almost everything, except the things that would matter most. The mall encounter that brought him back doesn't really make sense if you push on it, and the rest of the family seems to have accepted all of it without much comment. Which brings us to a broader question about who actually stays dead on this show, because the Brian death is the most famous example of a reset, but it's far from the only one. And the criteria for which deaths the show treats as permanent are not at all clear. The general rule for character death on this show is that the rule depends. Some deaths are permanent, some get reversed within an episode. The criteria for which has shifted across the show's run, and it's worth walking through who's actually still dead and who isn't. The big permanent deaths, the ones the show has committed to and not undone, are a surprisingly small list. Francis Griffin, Peter's adoptive father from the earlier seasons, died in Peter's 2 dads and did not return to life. He's been referenced occasionally in flashbacks, but the death has held. Diane Simmons, the news anchor and one of the show's more recognisable recurring characters, was killed in And Then There Were Fewer, the season 9 premiere, and has stayed dead. Muriel Goldman, Mort's wife, died in that same episode, and has also stayed dead. The Adam West character died in the show after Adam West the actor passed away in real life, and that death has held. That's most of it in terms of major recurring characters. There are a handful of others, like Pretty Patty, a minor recurring character who's been killed off and stayed gone. But the list of recurring characters who have died and stayed dead is shorter than you might think. The list of major deaths that have been undone or walked back is much longer. Brian, obviously. We've covered him. He died, came back, and has continued to be a central character for the years since. There's a fair argument that the audience never really registered the death as having happened, because the reversal came so quickly. Brian is currently as alive and present as he ever was. Lois has been killed multiple times in different storylines and always comes back. The most famous one is the Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie 2-parter in season 6. That's a thriller arc where Stewie actually appears to succeed in murdering his mother, takes over the world, and lives out his evil supervillain fantasy for an entire episode. Lois then kills Stewie in the second part, and the show seems to be writing itself into an impossible corner. The resolution is that the entire arc was a simulation. Stewie was running a hypothetical scenario in his head to see what would happen if he actually went through with his plans. None of it was real. Lois is fine. Stewie is fine. The world hasn't been taken over. Everything resets. That's a fairly extreme example of the reset button because the show committed enormous narrative resources to an arc that ultimately didn't happen. Both episodes are essentially elaborate dream sequences, but it set a precedent that the show could go anywhere, do anything, and just declare it didn't count if they wanted to. Peter has died or come close to dying multiple times. He's had near-death experiences in coma episodes. He's been declared legally dead in at least one episode, and then turned out to be fine. He's been resurrected by various supernatural means. None of it sticks. Stewie himself has had close calls. He's vanished from existence in the Brian rescue arc and came back the next episode. He's been killed in alternate timelines that turn out not to count. He's been in mortal peril dozens of times and always survives. The show seems to have developed a working principle, never explicitly stated, that the 5 core family members are essentially indestructible. Whatever happens to them in a given episode, they'll be fine by the next one. Recurring secondary characters can die and have it stick. Background characters die routinely without comment. But the Griffins are protected by the format itself. And then there are the in-between cases. Joe Swanson, as we discussed earlier, was briefly able to walk again in one storyline before becoming completely paralysed in the Running of the Bulls episode. That's not a death, but it's a similar pattern. A major character status was temporarily changed and then reverted. The show wanted Joe in a wheelchair, so Joe got back into the wheelchair, regardless of the in-universe story logic that had taken him out of it. Quagmire's daughter, Anna Lee, is another version of this. She was introduced in Quagmire's Baby, then placed for adoption, then occasionally mentioned, but not really included in the show's regular operations. She exists in the canon, but functionally not in the show. She's been alive, but invisible for years. What makes the death pattern strange is that the show clearly does take some deaths seriously. The Diane Simmons murder mystery is treated with weight. The episode is structured like an Agatha Christie story. The deaths in that episode are presented as real, painful events. The reveal of Diane as the killer is meant to land emotionally. The aftermath of the episode actually carries forward in some ways, with Mort having to navigate life without Muriel and various other characters processing the losses. So it's not that the show can't do permanence, it's that it picks and chooses, and the criteria aren't consistent. Adam West is an interesting case in this regard. The character was a beloved recurring presence, voiced by Adam West himself. When Adam West died in real life in 2017, the show eventually wrote his death into the canon. The character died from assassination during a town hall meeting in Family Guy. Mayor Adam West's death was acknowledged in the season 17 finale in Family Guy. Mayor West was succeeded by Wild Wild West, his cousin, voiced by another actor. The transition was handled with real respect. That's the show treating death as it would in real life. Permanent, weighty, requiring acknowledgement. Compare that to the Brian death, which was reversed within 3 episodes for an emotional payoff and a Christmas special return. The difference, of course, is that Adam West was responding to a real-world death. The actor was gone. The show couldn't keep the character going. The permanence was forced on them by reality. The Brian death wasn't forced. The character could have been kept dead. The actor was still available. The decision to bring him back was a creative choice, driven by audience reaction, which tells you something about how the show treats death. It's permanent when it has to be. It's reversible when the writers want it to be. There's another pattern worth mentioning, which is what I'd call the everyone but Lois forgets issue. The show has had major status changes for various characters that should ripple through future episodes, but mostly don't. Peter had a stroke in season 6. It's referenced briefly. He recovers. The stroke is mostly never mentioned again, even though strokes in real life have lasting effects and would change how a character functions. Peter goes back to being Peter. Joe's second paralysis, which I mentioned earlier, is similar. The injury happens, it's a significant moment. Then the show kind of moves on, and Joe is just Joe in a chair again, the way he was before the brief walking episodes. Quagmire became a father in Quagmire's baby. That fact about him doesn't really inform his character in subsequent episodes. He's still the same Quagmire he always was. The Griffin family won the lottery in season 10, and Peter became absurdly wealthy. They lost it all by the end of the episode. The wealth never carried forward. There were no consequences from that episode that show up later. Brian and Stewie altered the timeline of September 11th in Back to the Pilot. We'll come back to that in a bit, because it's worth its own conversation. But the alterations they made to history were undone within the episode. Nothing carries forward. The pattern is consistent. Major events happen, get treated as significant within the episode they air in, and then dissolve. The show resets to the default at the start of each new story. Whatever has happened, the family is back at the dinner table for next week's episode, the same as they were. That's the nature of the episodic sitcom, of course. Most animated comedies use the reset button as a structural principle. You can't build long-term consequences into a show that's meant to run forever, but Family Guy is unusual in how often it uses the reset for genuinely dramatic events. Other shows use the reset for smaller stuff. Family Guy resets murders, deaths, lottery wins, paralysis, strokes, world domination, alternate timelines, religious conversions, and historical alterations. The reset is the show's main relationship with its own dramatic moments. And honestly, I think this is part of why the show keeps working as a sitcom. Because no episode has to carry the weight of past episodes. Every story can stand on its own. The audience can come back week after week, year after year, knowing that whatever happened last time will mostly be cleaned up by the time they tune in. The cost is that nothing on the show feels lasting. Every drama has an implicit asterisk. Every reveal can be revoked. Every death might be undone. The dramatic stakes are perpetually negotiable. The show knows this. The audience knows this. And the show keeps making episodes anyway, because the next episode is the only one that matters. That's the way Family Guy treats death, and treats permanence in general. The show is built to keep going, not to remember, which leads us to a related issue. The specific scenes and episodes where the writing leaves visible gaps. The places where, even just within a single episode, things don't quite add up. There are a lot of these. Let me start with one of the most famous. The episode is called The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire. It aired in season 4. In that episode, Peter and Brian catch Loretta having an affair. They decide to investigate. They go over to Cleveland's house when he's not home, and they catch Loretta on the couch in the living room having sex with another man. Now this is the scene that contains the plot hole, because Peter and Brian are looking directly at this couple. They are in the same room as them. The couch is facing the front door. The man on top of Loretta is in plain view, and Peter and Brian somehow cannot identify him. Brian describes the man as a skinny white guy, and that's the best he can do. The man is Quagmire. Quagmire is Peter's best friend. They have known each other for years. They live next door to each other. They drink at the same bar 3 or 4 times a week. Peter has seen Quagmire in every possible state, including states that closely resemble what Quagmire is in at this exact moment. There is no version of Peter and Brian walking into that room and not knowing who's on the couch. But the episode needs the reveal to land at the end, so Peter and Brian don't know. They have to not know. The script requires them to not know. And so the show simply does not have them know. This kind of plot hole is interesting because it's not a continuity issue, it's a scene-level logic issue. The events of the episode happen in a specific order, and the order requires the characters to be temporarily stupider than they normally are. The show writes around the contradiction by having Peter act confused. Brian acts confused too, which is harder to swallow because Brian is supposed to be the smart one. But the episode powers through, and by the end, the reveal happens, and we're meant to be surprised. A lot of Family Guy episodes have this kind of scene-level inconsistency. Characters know things in one episode and don't know them in another. Characters who would normally recognize someone fail to recognize them because the plot needs them to. Characters who would normally do the obvious thing don't do it because the obvious thing would end the episode in 5 minutes. Here's another example, which is more of a long-running visual gag than a single episode plot hole, but it's worth talking about because it ran for years. Bonnie Swanson was pregnant for a very long time. Joe Swanson's wife, Bonnie, was introduced in the show pregnant, and she stayed pregnant for the better part of 7 seasons. Now, gestation in humans, as most people know, takes around 9 months. Bonnie was pregnant for over 50 real-time months across the show's run. That's not a typo. Bonnie was visibly pregnant in episodes that aired years apart, with no baby in between. The show didn't really address it for a long time. She was just always pregnant. It became a running visual element. You'd see Joe pushing his wheelchair, and Bonnie would be next to him with a baby bump, and that was just the situation. Eventually, in season 7, Bonnie gave birth in an episode called Ocean's 3.5. The baby was named Susie. After 6 years of being pregnant, Bonnie finally was not pregnant anymore. The show didn't explain what had taken so long. There was acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened, though mostly through throwaway jokes. Bonnie had a baby now. That was the new status quo. What's particularly strange is that Susie, the baby, has been depicted at various ages in the years since. Sometimes she's an infant, sometimes she's a toddler. Once, in an episode where she briefly spoke to Stewie, she revealed an inner monologue that suggested an adult level of awareness. Then in subsequent episodes, she was a regular baby again. The character exists in a similar floating age status to Stewie himself. So the Bonnie pregnancy timeline doesn't really work, but the show treated it as part of the joke, like a hyper-extended sight gag, and never really tried to make it make sense. The Mayor Adam West murder trial is another one of these. There's an episode where Adam West, the mayor of Quahog, is put on trial for murder. The episode is built around it. It's a major story for him. And then, when the episode ends, the trial just sort of goes away. He's back at his desk. He's still the mayor. The murder charge has evaporated. There's no explanation. The next episode he's in, the trial isn't mentioned. Whatever happened to that storyline happened off screen, in a place we don't have access to. This is a pattern. The show will set up dramatic episode-specific situations, run them through one episode of plot, and then quietly drop them. The status quo reasserts itself. The character goes back to being who they were before the episode happened. Peter defying the laws of physics is its own running issue. Family Guy doesn't operate by realistic physics, of course. It's a cartoon. But even within its own established rules, Peter occasionally does things that contradict what the show has shown about him in other episodes. Or he's been depicted as immensely heavy, with the show explicitly making jokes about his weight affecting things around him. And then in other episodes he'll jump on a trampoline, or do a flip, or perform some athletic feat that wouldn't be possible if his weight worked the way the show says it does. There are episodes where Peter has lost weight. There are episodes where he's gained weight. There are episodes where he's diagnosed with something physical, treated for it, and then, in the next episode, shows no sign of having had the condition. His body is whatever the episode needs it to be. The Skinny Peter episodes are a specific version of this. In a few different episodes, Peter has been depicted as having lost a significant amount of weight, usually for some plot reason. He'll be thin for the episode, sometimes with other characters reacting to the change. And then by the end of the episode, or by the next episode, he's back to his usual size. Whatever caused the weight loss has been undone. The reset has happened. There's an episode where Peter has a stroke, which I mentioned briefly earlier. That's another example of this pattern. Peter has a stroke in the middle of an episode. There are real consequences shown within the episode. Lois talks to Chris about the stroke being 3 months ago at one point, which fixes a specific timeline. Peter fakes going through rehabilitation, and then by the next episode, he's essentially fine. The stroke, which would in real life have lasting effects on a person's life, has been processed and absorbed and dismissed. One of the smaller but funnier inconsistencies in the show is from an episode called Baby Not On Board. This is an episode where the family goes on a road trip and accidentally forgets Stewie at home. The plot is built around the realization that they've left him behind. The setup includes a moment where Stewie escapes from his car seat before the trip starts, leaving the blanket arranged to look like he's still in it. So when the family loads the car, the seat looks occupied. They drive to New York. The problem with this setup, which a sharp-eyed viewer pointed out and is documented in various plot hole catalogues, is that the blanket was already arranged that way when the car left. Someone covered the seat with the blanket to make it look like Stewie was in it. But Stewie was the one who left the car. He didn't cover his own absence. So whoever covered the seat with the blanket knew Stewie wasn't in it. The show doesn't explain who that person was or what they were trying to accomplish. The blanket coverage is just there, an unexplained piece of stagecraft that makes the rest of the episode work. There's also the Stewie bets Brian about high school plot hole, from an episode where Brian and Stewie have a bet about whether Stewie can become the most popular kid at the local high school. The bet is supposed to last 1 week. The show has the bet running across what seems to be a much longer period. The events between the start of the bet and its resolution include the rebuilding of a McBurgertown restaurant, Peter's stroke and 3 months of recovery, and several other multi-week events. But the bet that's only supposed to last a week somehow encompasses all of this. These small-scale plot holes don't have the same weight as the bigger structural ones we've been talking about. They're more like sloppy edges than fundamental cracks, but they accumulate. When you watch enough of the show, you start to notice that the writers aren't really keeping track of episode internal timelines either. The events within a single episode can span longer than they should, or shorter than they should, depending on what the script needs. I think part of what's happening here is that Family Guy is structured around set pieces and bits more than continuous narrative. A typical episode is essentially a series of comedic sequences with thin connective tissue between them. The connective tissue doesn't have to hold up to scrutiny because the audience isn't really tracking it. They're tracking the jokes, but if you do track the connective tissue, the gaps are there. The same characters cannot recognize each other on a couch. A pregnancy lasts 6 years in the show. A murder trial can evaporate. A stroke can be forgotten. A bet can stretch impossibly long. The show is making different choices than a more carefully plotted show would. It's not bad choices exactly. It's just choices that prioritize a different thing than continuity. There's a second batch of these episode-level plot holes that's worth talking about, but I want to take a moment first. There's a list of storylines on this show that started, built momentum across multiple episodes, and then just stopped existing. The show set them up, ran with them for a while, and then put them down without saying anything. I want to walk through some of those, because they're a different kind of plot hole than the in-scene ones we just covered. These are more about what the show forgets to finish. The clearest example is the What Really Grinds My Gears segment. Peter, in this storyline, develops a segment for the local news where he goes on the air and complains about random things that annoy him. The bit becomes popular. He's a local celebrity for a few episodes. The arc actually spans more than one episode, which is unusual for the show. Peter's TV fame is treated as a real status change in his life. The way the arc ends involves Stewie. Stewie, in the same period, is trying to be nicer to people after a near-death experience. He's running around doing good deeds. One of his good deeds goes wrong, and he ends up crashing into the Drunken Clam, the bar Peter and his friends drink at. Peter gets in trouble for the crash somehow, and he loses his news segment as a result. To fix everything, Stewie uses his time machine to go back in time and prevent the accident from happening. The reset is supposed to put everything right. The episode ends. The problem is what happens next. If the reset worked, Peter should still have his news segment. He should still be a local celebrity. The whole reason the segment got cancelled was the crash, and the crash now never happened. So Peter should be on TV. He isn't. The next episode of the show treats Peter as if he never had a news segment in the first place. The whole arc is gone. Peter's brief career as a commentator has been erased not just from the events of that episode, but from the show's memory entirely. The reset went one step too far. This is, in fairness, sort of how time travel resets work in the show generally. The Brian death reset removed Vinny from the family's life. The Lois kills Stewie reset removed the entire simulated takeover. The show treats time travel resets as if they erase everything, including the parts the audience experienced. But it's still strange when the show goes out of its way to give Peter a multi-episode career and then quietly takes it back. Brian's therapy storyline is another one of these. In the early seasons, Brian was depicted as being in therapy. He had a therapist. He talked about his struggles with anxiety, depression, his sense of failure as a writer. It was an interesting layer to the character. It made him feel more textured. When the show was cancelled and then revived, the therapy storyline was just gone. Brian isn't in therapy in the post-revival seasons. He doesn't talk about it. His therapist is never mentioned. The whole emotional infrastructure that had been built around him in the early seasons was removed without comment when the show came back. You could argue this is a normal consequence of a long hiatus. The show came back, the writers wanted to take Brian in different directions, and the therapy thing didn't fit the new tone. But the absence is still notable. Brian, in the original conception, was a character who needed therapy. The revival just decided he didn't need it anymore. The cannibalism episode is one I think about more than I should. It's a season 11 episode where the Griffins go on an expedition to Mount Everest. Things go wrong. Peter and his friends get stranded. They have to eat people to survive. The episode plays this for dark comedy, the way Family Guy plays a lot of things. But then the episode ends, and the family's back home, and the cannibalism is never referenced again. They ate people. The show committed to that as a thing that happened to them. And then it stopped being a thing. Cannibalism, even in cartoon terms, is the kind of event that would change a person. The Donner Party survivors carried it with them for the rest of their lives. People who've eaten human flesh under survival conditions, in real life, often describe it as something they can't fully move past. The Griffins ate people and then went back to bickering at the dinner table the next week as if nothing had happened. This is the show's general approach to dark events, of course. They happen, they're treated as funny in the moment, and then they get filed away. The dark humour doesn't really linger. The characters aren't changed by the things they do. I want to talk a bit about the lottery storyline too, because it's a clean example of how the show handles this changes everything moments. In a season 10 episode, the Griffins win the lottery. Peter becomes obscenely wealthy. He buys ridiculous things. He alienates his friends with his new arrogance. He acts out the cliché of the new money idiot. By the end of the episode, Peter has gone bankrupt. The family is back where they started. The lottery money is gone, either spent or lost or somehow taken away. The status quo is restored about 2 episodes later, when Stewie goes back in time. This is, as I said earlier, normal sitcom mechanics. You can't have your characters be permanently rich on a show about a working-class family in Rhode Island. But the episode does treat the lottery win as if it really happened, with real consequences, before erasing all of it within the same half hour. It's another version of the reset, just compressed into one episode instead of stretched across an arc. The 9/11 alteration in Back to the Pilot is the most extreme example of this pattern. We're going to talk about that episode in detail later because it deserves its own conversation. But the short version is that Brian and Stewie go back in time, and Brian decides to warn his past self, about the September 11th attacks. The past Brian goes on to prevent the attacks. The result, in the new timeline, is a post-apocalyptic America with a second civil war. Brian and Stewie have to go back again and undo the prevention. The original timeline is restored. So 9/11 doesn't happen. The horrific thing happens. The show, by the end of the episode, has decided that 9/11 happening was actually the better outcome, and the alternative was worse. That's a remarkable position for any show to take, especially for a comedy. The episode plays a lot of it for laughs, but it lands somewhere that I find genuinely unsettling. And then within the same episode, Brian tries another alteration. He gives himself credit for the Harry Potter novels. In the new timeline, Brian is the author of Harry Potter, not J.K. Rowling. This is supposed to be a small selfish change he makes after the bigger fix. The episode then goes through a series of escalating attempts to fix the timeline, including a scene where 50 different versions of Brian and Stewie from different futures all show up to vote on whether they should prevent 9/11 again. The vote goes against prevention. Everyone agrees, after a lot of futures worth of experience, that the worst timeline isn't worth the trade. What gets dropped, what gets forgotten, is that this entire scenario happened. The show acknowledges on screen that the time travelers regularly make changes to history. The cost of those changes is real. They've explored multiple timelines. They've seen what happens in different futures. They've voted, as a group of selves, on the right ethical course of action, and then they go home and never reference any of it again. The implications of having multiple versions of yourself voting on history don't carry forward. The knowledge of what alternate timelines look like doesn't change how Brian or Stewie behave. The next episode resumes as if Back to the Pilot was just a fun adventure. This pattern of major events not carrying forward is so consistent across the show that I think it has to be a deliberate philosophical choice rather than an oversight. The writers know what they're doing. They want the show to be able to keep producing new stories indefinitely, which means it can't be weighed down by its own past. Every episode has to start fresh. Every dramatic moment has to be containable within the episode it appears in. But the cost of that approach is that the show feels increasingly weightless as it goes on. Major events don't really matter, because the show has told us, through pattern after pattern, that nothing major really sticks. The audience learns this. After 2 decades of watching Family Guy reset itself, you start to internalize that any given dramatic moment is provisional, which is fine for what the show is. It's a sitcom. It's not trying to be a tragedy, but it does mean that when you sit down and try to identify the lost storylines, the dropped arcs, the unfinished business, the list gets very long. Almost every major creative direction the show has tried to take has been quietly walked back at some point. The show keeps going by treating its own past as optional, and speaking of things the show has quietly walked back, there's a whole category of characters who have been introduced, developed, and then almost entirely abandoned. We'll spend some time with them. The pattern goes something like this. A new character is introduced. They have a strong design, a clear personality, a recognizable voice. They get featured in an episode that builds around them. They become part of the world of Quahog. Fans get to know them. And then, gradually, they fade. They show up less. They become background presences. Sometimes they disappear entirely. The show doesn't explain. They were just there, and then they weren't. We talked about Vinny and New Brian already. They're part of this pattern, but they're also a specific subcategory, the replacement dog category. The broader pattern affects a lot more characters than those two. The clearest example, in my opinion, is Neil Goldman. Neil is the son of Mort and Muriel Goldman. In the early to middle seasons of the show, Neil was a recurring presence. He was Meg's obsessive, unwelcome admirer. The bit was that Neil was deeply in love with Meg, and Meg, despite being treated as unattractive by the universe of the show, was still completely uninterested in him. Neil was someone she felt superior to, which was a rare position for Meg to be in. The dynamic was a recurring source of humour in early seasons. Then Neil mostly vanishes from the show after season 12. He still exists in the canon. He shows up occasionally in crowd shots. He's been in a handful of background scenes over the years. But the active use of the character as a recurring presence, while less frequent than some other characters, continues. There are episodes where Mort and Muriel are featured, where Neil should be present, and he just isn't. When Muriel is murdered in the season 9 premiere, Neil's absence from the aftermath is notable. His mother is dead. He should be a part of that story. He isn't. He's just gone. The evil monkey is another one. The evil monkey was a recurring character who lived in Chris's closet. The joke in the early seasons was that Chris was terrified of an evil monkey that lived in his closet, but his parents didn't believe him. The monkey would appear at the closet door, point ominously at Chris, and then disappear. It was a great running gag, visually striking, reliably funny. Eventually, the show gave the evil monkey a backstory episode. We learned that he wasn't actually evil, just depressed about his life. He had marital problems. He'd lost custody of his children. He was lashing out because of personal grief. The backstory humanized him, which was sweet, but it also kind of defanged the character. The monkey couldn't really be scary anymore once we knew about his divorce. After the backstory, the evil monkey appears in fewer and fewer episodes. He's still technically in the canon. He's referenced occasionally, but the recurring presence of him in Chris's closet, which was once one of the show's reliable visual gags, just stopped happening. The monkey moved out at some point in a way the show acknowledged in passing, and then the whole bit was retired. Bertram is a third example, and this one is sadder because Bertram was set up as a major nemesis. Bertram is Stewie's evil half-brother. He was introduced as a sperm bank conception, biologically related to Peter via accidentally contaminated samples. Stewie meets Bertram in a sibling rivalry episode, recognizes him as a threat, and the two of them have a recurring, antagonistic dynamic. Bertram appeared in a few episodes across the early and later seasons. The most prominent one is The Big Bang Theory, where Bertram tries to kill Leonardo da Vinci, who is established as Stewie's ancestor, in order to remove Stewie from existence. The episode plays out as a time travel showdown. Stewie wins, Bertram is defeated. After that, Bertram more or less disappears. He's been mentioned occasionally. He hasn't been a regular feature of the show in years. For a character who was set up as Stewie's primary recurring nemesis, his absence is noticeable. Stewie has spent the years since The Big Bang Theory mostly without a major antagonist. The Bertram storyline could have continued. The writers just chose not to continue it. Quagmire's father is another character with a strange arc. The character was originally introduced as Lieutenant Dan Quagmire, a decorated military veteran and one of Quagmire's biggest sources of pride. Then in a later episode, Lieutenant Dan came out as a transgender woman, transitioned and became Ida. The transition was treated by the standards of the show with relative seriousness. Quagmire struggled to accept his parents' new identity. The episode tried to land somewhere thoughtful. Then Ida had intermittent appearances across several seasons, though with gaps between her major storylines. There have been several recurring appearances since the transition episode, but Ida is not a regular fixture of the show. The character, who was set up as one of the recurring Quagmire family elements, has mostly faded from view. Quagmire's broader family, including the daughter we mentioned earlier and the sister Brenda, has been similarly downplayed in later seasons. Connie D'Amico is a character worth mentioning here. Connie was the popular mean girl at Meg and Chris's school, a recurring presence in early seasons. She represented the standard high school antagonist for Meg's storylines. She had her own personality, her own design, but her personality remained largely unchanged throughout the series. Then she sort of stopped existing as a feature. Meg's school storylines in later seasons mostly don't involve Connie. The standard antagonist role has been picked up by other characters, or just dropped. Loretta Brown, Cleveland's first wife, has a strange situation. She was killed off in Gone with the Wind, I believe, the Cleveland show episode, not in the Family Guy murder mystery, where Diane Simmons did the killing. So she's actually one of the permanent deaths from earlier in our conversation. But her absence from the show is part of this same pattern. Cleveland has moved on. Donna, his second wife, is now the established Cleveland family character. Loretta is gone, and occasionally mentioned, even though she was a significant presence in earlier seasons. Patrick Pewterschmidt is another character of this type. Patrick is Lois's brother. He was introduced in an episode where it turns out he's been institutionalized for years and becomes a serial killer after his release. He's the kind of character that, in a different show, would become a major recurring presence, a serial killer in the family. That's the kind of premise that has legs. Patrick has shown up a few times since his introduction, but he's not a regular feature of the show. The serial killer brother thing exists as a piece of canon, but it doesn't really inform the show on an ongoing basis. Lois extensively discusses Patrick being a serial killer, from learning about the murders to being shown photographic evidence by Brian and ultimately confronting him about his crimes. The family doesn't reference it. It's a fact about her that's been allowed to recede. Pretty much every recurring character on the show, outside of the immediate Griffin family and the immediate friend group of Peter and Brian, has had this happen to them at some point. The show introduces them, finds something interesting to do with them for a few episodes, and then lets them drift. You can see something similar with the various love interests Brian has dated. Gillian, the very pretty and very dumb girlfriend, was a major recurring character for several seasons. Then she got married to someone else and basically vanished. Brian has dated dozens of women across the show's run, including some, like Cheryl Tiegs, who are played by their real-life selves. Most of those relationships are forgotten by the next episode. The dating history just kind of exists as a backdrop. The pattern, I think, comes from how the show is written. Family Guy doesn't have a writer's room that's tracking the long-term development of secondary characters. It has a writer's room that's coming up with the next episode. Characters get introduced because they're useful for an episode. They get developed if the writers find them interesting. They get forgotten when the next episode goes in a different direction. For a sitcom, this is normal. Cheers had recurring characters who came and went. The Simpsons has done this with hundreds of characters. Frasier did it. Seinfeld did it. The format encourages a certain amount of character churn, especially over a long run. But Family Guy has had so many of these characters across so many years that the cumulative effect is significant. The show is populated by ghosts, characters who used to matter and don't anymore, storylines that used to be running threads and are now historical footnotes. The Quahog of Season 25 is structurally different from the Quahog of Season 3, not because the show has explicitly moved on from the earlier setup, but because so many of the earlier characters have just fallen out of use. If you were to make a list of every recurring character who's been featured in a Family Guy episode since 1999, and then mark which ones are still in regular rotation today, the list of the currently used characters would be much shorter than the list of the abandoned ones. The show keeps refreshing its supporting cast. Old characters get put on the shelf. New characters get tried out. Most of the new ones eventually get shelved too. That's a strange thing about a show with this much history. The history is mostly inactive. The show exists in a perpetual present, where the only characters who really count are the ones being written this season. I think about the evil monkey sometimes. He had a whole emotional backstory. He didn't get a name. He had a family. He was a real character, briefly. And then the show quietly moved on without him. That's a fate that has befallen a lot of these characters, and the show is going to keep doing this for as long as it runs. Which brings us to one of the more interesting things about Family Guy, which is how openly it acknowledges its own messiness. The show is, in a strange way, aware of all this, and it has, on a few different occasions, made entire episodes about being aware of it. The episode is called Road to the Multiverse. It aired in 2009 as the premiere of Season 8. It's one of the highest rated Family Guy episodes on IMDb, sitting at around a 9.1 out of 10. A lot of people consider it one of the show's best episodes. It's also, when you really sit with it, the most canon-warping piece of storytelling the show has ever produced. The premise is that Stewie has built a multiverse remote control. The remote lets him and Brian travel between parallel universes. Across the episode, they visit a series of alternate quahogs. They visit a universe where Christianity never existed, so technology and science are vastly more advanced. They visit a universe where everything is done in the style of Disney animation, with the Griffin family rendered as charming forest creatures who break into song. They visit a universe where Stewie is fully grown but stuck inside a baby's body. They visit a universe where dogs are the dominant species and humans are pets. That last one is the universe they end up trapped in. Brian gets to live as a peer to other dogs, with humans as the underclass, and he likes it. He doesn't want to leave. Stewie has to convince him to come home. The episode resolves with them returning to the original quahog and putting the multiverse remote away. Now here's the thing. The episode establishes that infinite parallel universes exist. It explicitly says, in dialogue, that anything that can happen is happening somewhere. The Griffins exist in countless versions, across countless realities. Every possible configuration of their lives is playing out somewhere in the multiverse. That's an enormous piece of world building. In any other show, that would be a foundational reveal that affects everything going forward. It would mean that every plot decision the writers make is just one possibility among infinite alternatives. It would mean that any continuity error could be explained as a slip between universes. It would open up storytelling options that wouldn't otherwise be available. The show uses it for the episode and then puts it away. The multiverse remote doesn't come back as a regular device. The implications of infinite alternate Brians and Stewies don't ripple forward. Subsequent episodes treat the world of Quahog as if it's still the only Quahog that matters. The whole concept is a one-off. You can sort of understand why. Multiverse storytelling is hard to maintain because it dilutes everything. If there are infinite versions of your characters, no single version really matters. The show would lose the emotional anchor of having one definitive Peter, one definitive Brian. So the writers introduced the concept, played with it for one of their best ever episodes, and then quietly retired it. The episode does get referenced sometimes. There have been brief callbacks, there's been the occasional return to the multiverse for a quick gag, but the framework that Road to the Multiverse established is mostly inert in the canon. It's there if anyone wants to use it. They mostly don't. Back to the pilot, which we've talked about a few times, is the show's most explicit piece of meta-commentary about its own evolution. We've covered the time travel and 9/11 stuff. What I want to focus on here is the part where Stewie and Brian arrive in 1999 and start commenting on what they see. The Griffins of 1999 are drawn in a different animation style. The show was originally produced by Film Roman, and the early season art has a different quality than the current art. The character designs are slightly different. The line work is different. The colours are different. The mouth movements are different. When Stewie and Brian arrive, they see this older version of their own family, and they react to it. Stewie comments on Peter's eye drifting over his nose, which is an actual animation error from the original pilot that the show has now turned into a self-aware joke. Stewie comments on Meg sounding different, which she does, because in the actual pilot Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert. Before Mila Kunis took over the role permanently, the show is openly pointing at its own production history. The pacing of the past Griffin family is different too. The 1999 family pauses to allow for cutaways. The cutaways themselves are shown, which is part of the joke. The structure of the show is being commented on by the show. The audience is being told, in real time, that the show used to have a different rhythm. This is a remarkable piece of self-reflection. The episode is saying, on screen, that Family Guy is not the same show it was when it started. The animation has changed, the voice acting has changed, the comedy structure has changed, the relationship between the family members has changed, and the show is openly acknowledging this through the time travel premise. The acknowledgement doesn't really go anywhere, of course. The episode plays the differences as jokes and then sends Stewie and Brian back to the present. The current Family Guy isn't actually held accountable to the older version of itself. The differences are noted and then absorbed back into the joke economy. But the show knows it's a different show now. 25 years of production will do that to anything. The Family Guy of the late 1990s was a sharper, more grounded family sitcom that happened to have a baby supervillain and a talking dog. The Family Guy of today is a much more freewheeling, cutaway-based comedy that's mostly given up on grounded family storytelling. The two shows share a name and a cast and a setting, but they're functionally different products. The cutaway gag itself is worth a quick word here, because it's the show's main mechanism for avoiding continuity. A cutaway is a non-sequitur visual joke that interrupts the main plot to riff on something else. The cutaways are explicitly outside the canon. Nothing that happens in a cutaway counts. The show can have Peter say, "Remember the time we fought a giant chicken?" and then show an elaborate chicken fight that has never been mentioned before, and that doesn't have to be reconciled with anything. This means the show has a permanent escape hatch from continuity. Cutaway gags are intentional narrative devices that require explicit character framing and cannot be retroactively applied to explain away plot holes. The structure of the show is built to accommodate inconsistency by default. The audience knows not to apply continuity to the cutaways. The continuity is reserved for the main plot, which itself is loosely tracked. The non-canon episodes are another version of this. The show has produced several episodes that exist explicitly outside the main canon. There are the Family Guy viewer mail episodes, which are anthology episodes presenting short, alternate universe stories framed as audience-submitted ideas. There is the Three Kings episode, which retells Stephen King novels with the Griffin cast. There is the Grim Job episode, which retells fairy tales. There are the Star Wars trilogy parodies, which retell the original Star Wars films with the cast. None of those episodes are considered part of the show's main timeline. What's interesting about these non-canon episodes is that the show occasionally treats them as if they were canon when convenient. There are references to events from non-canon episodes in regular episodes. There are jokes that assume the audience remembers events that happened in stories that were explicitly outside the regular continuity. The line between what counts and what doesn't is constantly being adjusted. PTV is a specific episode worth mentioning here. It aired in season 4 after the show's revival, and it's an episode about Peter starting his own unregulated television network to escape FCC content restrictions. The premise is openly metafictional. The episode is a comedy about a show like Family Guy, fighting to make the kind of jokes Family Guy makes. The show is, on screen, complaining about its own censorship situation. That episode predicts a lot of the future of the show, in a way. It establishes that Family Guy thinks of itself as a transgressive comedy fighting against institutional restriction. It also establishes that the show is willing to use its own platform to comment on its own conditions of production. That self-aware streak has continued through the rest of the series. Family Guy has made many episodes about itself, about its critics, about its place in television, about its longevity. The show talks about itself constantly. Seth MacFarlane has been openly acknowledging in interviews that the show doesn't try to be consistent. He's said it many times in different ways. The show prioritizes jokes over continuity. The show isn't built around a series Bible. The show is a vehicle for comedy, not a sustained dramatic work. He's been frank about this for years. That openness is, in its own way, refreshing. Most shows that have continuity problems don't acknowledge them. They just try to muddle through and hope viewers don't notice. Family Guy, both through MacFarlane's interviews and through its own meta episodes, has been willing to say out loud that consistency isn't the goal. The goal is the next funny thing. I think that's the most honest answer to a lot of the questions we've been talking about tonight. Why does Stewie have multiple sexualities? Why does Brian have 3 origin stories? Why is Quagmire 61 and also in his 40s? Why do major events get reset? Why do recurring characters disappear? Why does the time machine work differently every episode? The answer, the show would say, is that none of those questions are the show's actual concern. The show's concern is the joke. The joke is the unit of value. Everything else exists to support the next joke. It's a working philosophy. It's just a different philosophy than most shows operate by. And it produces both the strengths and the weaknesses of the show as we have it. The strengths are the agility, the willingness to go anywhere, the lack of weight that lets the show keep producing new ideas. The weaknesses are the ones we've been cataloguing for the last 2 hours. Which brings us in a roundabout way to the most unsettling lampshade moment in the whole show. The one I've been circling around all night. In an episode, Stewie and Brian go back to 1999 and save 9/11. That episode has more inside it than we've covered yet, and it deserves a quiet conversation of its own. Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of September 11th, 2001. That was the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. He missed the flight by about 10 minutes. The reason he missed it has been told in different ways over the years. One reported reason Seth MacFarlane missed the flight is that he was hungover and his travel agent had listed an incorrect departure time. His travel agent gave him the wrong departure time. He was hungover from the night before. Different versions in different interviews. What's not in dispute is that he was supposed to be on that plane. If he'd made it, Family Guy as we know it wouldn't exist. He created the show. He voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, among many others. The show was still airing when 9/11 happened, before the season 3 cancellation. The revival that brought it back wouldn't come for another 3 years. Without MacFarlane, none of what came after that morning would have happened. This isn't a piece of show trivia. It's the central biographical fact about the creator of one of the longest-running animated comedies in history. He almost died in the most public mass casualty event of his lifetime. He didn't. And he went on to make a show that has been watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. And then 10 years later, that show made an episode where his characters go back in time and try to prevent 9/11 from happening. The episode is Back to the Pilot, which we've been circling. We've covered the time travel mechanics. We've covered the meta-commentary on the show's own evolution. What we haven't really sat with is the part of the episode where Brian decides, for entirely selfish reasons, to tell his past self about the September 11th attacks. The intent isn't humanitarian. Brian isn't trying to save lives. He's trying to position himself to take credit for the prediction. He wants his past self to warn the FBI in advance, so that when the attacks fail to happen, Brian Griffin gets the credit for preventing them. He sees 9/11 as a career opportunity. That's the framing the episode uses for the choice. The result, as we've discussed, is a post-apocalyptic America. The successful prevention of 9/11 creates a new timeline where the country falls into civil war, ends up at war with itself in some apocalyptic configuration, and is essentially destroyed. The implication is that 9/11 was somehow load-bearing for the stability of the world that follows it. Take it away, and everything collapses. That's a position that a lot of viewers found uncomfortable, then and now. The argument the episode makes on its face is that 9/11 needed to happen, that whatever followed from it was preferable to the alternative, that the attacks were, in some twisted cosmic accounting, the better outcome. It's a comedy show, of course. The episode isn't really making a serious philosophical argument. It's playing with time travel paradox for jokes. The post-apocalyptic America is itself a joke setting, exaggerated for absurdist effect. The vote scene at the end, where dozens of alternate Brians and Stewies all weigh in, is structured for comedy more than for ethical seriousness. But the underlying choice the show made to write an episode that has its characters undo the prevention of 9/11 is hard to ignore. especially given who made it. Seth MacFarlane was, by his own account, late for the flight and missed boarding when the gate was closed. He almost was one of the casualties, and then he made the show that a decade later decided through a comedy episode that the attacks needed to happen. You can read this a couple of different ways. The most generous reading is that it's a piece of dark self-therapy. MacFarlane survived something he shouldn't have survived, and the show is processing the absurdity of that through fiction. The episode is, in some way, an artist working through his own near miss with mortality. The fact that the show treats his own potential death as a load-bearing element of the timeline is maybe the only way he could think about it without breaking down. A less generous reading is that the show was being glib about something that didn't need to be revisited at all. 20 years of distance had made 9/11 fair game for comedy in some quarters, and Family Guy took its shot. The episode landed where it landed. Some people found it funny, some people didn't. There's also a wider context here, which is that Family Guy has had a complicated relationship with 9/11 across the show's run. Multiple episodes have included 9/11 jokes that were later edited or pulled from streaming versions. There's an episode called Turban Cowboy from season 11 where Peter befriends a man who turns out to be a terrorist. In one of the cutaways, Peter is shown running over runners at the Boston Marathon. The cutaway aired in March of 2013. The Boston Marathon bombing happened in April of 2013, about 3 weeks later. The cutaway was pulled from Hulu and Fox's website after the bombing. The episode itself was put back into circulation later, but the timing of the gag versus the real-world event was uncomfortable enough that the streaming services made the call to take it down temporarily. There have been other 9/11 adjacent jokes that have been quietly edited out of streaming versions. The PTV episode I mentioned earlier has a cold open that involves 9/11 imagery, and that opening has been altered in some versions. Various other cutaways have been adjusted over the years. The show has a back catalogue of 9/11 humour that the streaming services have, here and there, decided was no longer something they wanted to host. The bigger meta question I keep coming back to, though, is the one about Brian and Stewie's time machine. Once the show establishes, in Back to the Pilot, that the characters can go back and undo major historical events, you have to ask why they aren't using that capacity more often. We talked about this with the Brian death arc. Stewie has the ability to fix things. He uses it sparingly. Brian is in the same position. He could go back and prevent any number of family tragedies. He could prevent his own near-death experiences. He could prevent the death of Diane Simmons. He could prevent Bonnie's 7-year pregnancy, somehow. He could prevent the various small horrors of the Griffin family's life. He doesn't. After the events of Back to the Pilot, he goes home and he stops using the time machine for anything serious. The capacity is there, the will isn't. The closest thing the show has to an explanation is that altering the timeline has consequences. We see this in the post-apocalyptic version of America. Altering one event creates cascading changes that may be worse than the original event. So Brian and Stewie, having learned that lesson, decide to leave history alone. But Brian saved his own life later in the same way. Stewie used the time machine to save him from dying. If the lesson of Back to the Pilot was that you shouldn't alter the timeline, that lesson was abandoned within a couple of seasons. The time machine is back to being a tool the characters use when they want to. What I think is actually happening is that the show wants the freedom to use time travel for individual stories without committing to its implications. The time machine is a plot device that can do whatever the episode needs. It can save Brian, it can undo 9/11, it can not undo 9/11, it can take Stewie to ancient Rome for a half-hour adventure. The rules of the machine are just to fit the story being told. That's fine for a comedy. It's how most comedy time travel stories work. But because Family Guy has used the time machine in such weighty moments, the inconsistency becomes visible. The audience has been shown that the characters can alter history. The audience has been shown that they sometimes choose to and sometimes choose not to. and the choices don't seem to follow any consistent rule. Whether you read all this as cosmic acceptance, the show making peace with the necessity of history's worst moments, or as the show simply running out of room in its own logic, the result is the same. Family Guy has decided which timelines stay, and that includes the ones we'd rather it didn't. The show is going to be on the air for a long time. We're more than 20 seasons in, and there's no end visible. The contradictions we've talked about tonight are going to keep accumulating. New episodes are going to add new inconsistencies. Old characters are going to be quietly forgotten. Stewie is going to keep being whatever the next episode needs him to be. Brian is going to keep having more origin stories. The timeline is going to keep being whatever the writers want it to be at any given moment. And the show will keep working, mostly, for the people who watch it. Because the show was never asking us to track the canon. It was asking us to laugh at the jokes. The canon is a byproduct. The continuity is incidental. The jokes are the thing. I find something almost peaceful about that, actually. There's a version of being a Family Guy fan where you sit down to watch and you let the contradictions go. You enjoy what's in front of you. You don't worry about whether it lines up with what came before. You take each episode on its own terms. That's the way I think the show wants to be watched, honestly. As a series of jokes about a stable set of characters in a town that doesn't quite exist in any consistent way. The fact that we can spend 2 hours like tonight, picking at the seams, is a sign that we've been watching closely enough to see them, but it's not really how the show is meant to be consumed, which feels like a reasonable place to start winding down. We've covered a lot of ground. Before we wrap up, let me sit with a few of the broader things this whole conversation has pointed at. We've spent the better part of 2 hours pulling at the seams of a show that's been on the air since 1999. We've gone through Brian's 3 origin stories. We've talked about Peter's 2 fathers and Meg's possibly 2 fathers. We've sat with Quagmire's age problem, which never quite resolves. We've walked through the time machine and how it never quite follows its own rules. We've talked about who stays dead and who doesn't. We've gone through episode-level gaps and abandoned characters and the show's strange, almost loving relationship with its own messiness. And the thing I keep coming back to is that none of this makes Family Guy a bad show. It just makes it the show that it is. A show that prioritizes the next joke over a clean continuity. A show that's willing to undo its own decisions if the audience reacts the wrong way. A show that knows it doesn't make sense and has, on more than one occasion, made entire episodes about that knowledge. The plot holes we've talked about are the trace evidence of a show that's been made by a lot of different people over a lot of different years. They're what happens when you put hundreds of episodes through a writer's room that prioritizes weekly comedy over long-term coherence. They're what accumulates when a show outlives its own original creative vision and gets passed through enough hands. You can't really make a show like this without ending up where Family Guy ended up. Every long-running animated comedy has these problems. The Simpsons has them. South Park has them. Bob's Burgers has them. The format demands a certain amount of forgetting. The format rewards forgetting. The audience, by and large, forgets too. We watch the next episode, and we don't bring the last one with us. There's still plenty more to talk about, by the way. The celebrity guest contradictions are their own category. The post-2020 episodes have introduced new inconsistencies that I didn't get into tonight. The Stewie multiverse remote has implications we barely touched. The James Woods episodes have their own continuity questions. The new Hulu specials and the deal with Comedy Central have created new wrinkles. The cutaway gags, which I deliberately set aside at the start of this video, are a whole separate conversation about how Family Guy uses non-canonical material to expand its joke economy. Any of those would make a video on their own. For now, though, this feels like a reasonable place to leave it. The show is still on the air. Season 24 is happening. There's a season 25 on the way. The inconsistencies will keep piling up. Stewie remained a year old for several seasons. Brian drives a Toyota Prius, specifically a 2004 model. The claim about Israeli politics cannot be verified from available search results. Quagmire will keep being whichever age the episode requires. Joe will keep being in the wheelchair, with occasional walks that don't last. Meg will turn 19. Chris will keep being in some kind of high school. Peter will keep being Peter. And the theme song, that old swing number that Walter Murphy wrote back in the late 1990s, will keep playing somewhere. On some screen, in some room, in some corner of the world. Right now, the way it's been playing more or less continuously since January 31st, 1999. The show outlasts its own continuity. That's, in the end, the strangest thing about it. The contradictions don't catch up with it. The plot holes don't drag it down. The accumulated weight of its own inconsistencies doesn't slow it. It keeps going. It just keeps going. I find something almost reassuring about that, if I'm being honest. There's a version of long-form storytelling that demands consistency, that punishes itself for every contradiction, that tries to be a sealed system, that holds together under pressure. And then there's Family Guy, which has decided to just keep telling jokes for the next 25 years and let the seams show wherever they show. Wherever you are tonight, thanks for being here. Whether you're a long-time fan who's been quietly nodding along and thinking of plot holes I didn't mention, or someone who hasn't watched the show in years and just wanted something familiar to fall asleep to, I appreciate the company. There's no big finish here, just a quiet sign-off. The show is still going. The Griffins are still in Quahog. Brian was writing that novel he eventually finished. Stewie is still planning something. Meg is still being ignored. Peter is still being Peter. And somewhere out there, in some episode that hasn't aired yet, a new plot hole is waiting to be written. Stay safe. Sweet dreams.